Tonight, where, oh where do the billions go? One congressman wants to know and calls the Fed on the carpet.
One person having the power to disburse $1 trillion without checking with the president, without talking to Congress, without being subject to the Freedom of Information Act, without having any auditing, this is outrageous.
The Marines move south on the front lines of the surge in Afghanistan.
For 14 months, this district center was essentially under siege.
And reporting on the war, the observations of two journalists who hike into Helmand Province with U.S. forces.
They're accomplishing the mission they've been given, but they need to know how this mission fits into a reasonable, larger strategic plan for Afghanistan.
We'll bring you the news tonight on Dan Rather Reports. Good evening. So, what if you gave one person the authority to lend more than $1 trillion, no questions asked? By all estimates, that's exactly what Ben Bernanke did as chairman of the Federal Reserve last year when the U.S. economy was teetering on the brink of collapse. The Federal Reserve, or Fed as it's commonly known, is the central bank of the United States, charged by Congress with setting the crucial but seemingly mundane monetary policy. But the Fed can also step in times of crisis and loan money in secret. And that's the rub. The Fed has never acknowledged where many of the billions of dollars were spent. The action by the Fed may have saved the economy from financial meltdown, but all those secret loans have led to a torrent of new criticism, much of it championed by a man in Washington few have ever heard of.
We have an organization now that can willy-nilly hand out $1 trillion and is accountable to no one.
Meet freshman Congressman Alan Grayson, the first Democrat in 34 years to represent Orlando's 8th District.
Think about that. One person, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, having the power to disburse $1 trillion without checking with the president, without talking to Congress, without being subject to the Freedom of Information Act, without having any auditing, this is outrageous.
Grayson was raised in a tough neighborhood in the Bronx. He worked his way through Harvard Law School, founded a telecommunications company that grew into a multi-billion-dollar business, and made a name for himself prosecuting Iraq War profiteers.
Florida's taxpayers are being robbed.
But it was a clever advertising campaign that helped him unseat a 4-term Republican congressman in a very Republican district.
Send me to Washington and I'll put a stop to taxpayer robbery. Stop! Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now, as a junior member of the House Financial Services Committee, the congressman with the colorful clothes is tackling what he calls the biggest, most secret bailout of them all: the Federal Reserve's emergency lending program.
Mr. Cohen, you just said that $1.2 trillion has been lent or spent, as the case may be. That's $4,000 for every man, woman, and child in this country. Don't Americans have the right to know how you spent that money?
Grayson wanted to find out where the money went, and so last May he grilled the Federal Reserve's Inspector General, Elizabeth Coleman.
Have you reached any conclusions about the Fed expanding its balance sheet by over $1 trillion since last September?
We have not yet reached any conclusions.
Do you know who received that money?
We're in the process right now of doing our review, and
Right, but you're the Inspector General. My question to you specifically is, do you know who received that $1 trillion plus that the Fed extended and put on its balance sheet since last September? Do you know the identity of the recipients?
I do not know. We have not looked at that specific area at this particular point on those reviews.
The hearing room had emptied, and the exchange seemed destined for C-SPAN obscurity until one of Grayson's staffers posted it on YouTube, where it hit a nerve.
Mr. Chairman, my time is up, but I have to tell you honestly, I am shocked to find out that nobody at the Federal Reserve, including the Inspector General, is keeping track of this.
2.5 million clicks and counting. At 6'5", Grayson's the tallest man on the committee, but he's the most junior in status. you're a junior congressman, first-term congressman, so you come last. The room pretty much clears out.
That's right, and sometimes I have to wait for hours until it's my turn. But if in the case of the Inspector General of the Federal Reserve, I'll wait.
The Inspector General for the Federal Reserve, how did she get that job?
She got that job because the Federal Reserve appointed her. You know, in general, inspectors general are supposed to be watchdogs, are supposed to be independent of their agencies. That's why we have a general accounting office, a government accountability office. It's independent. But in her case, she was appointed by the Federal Reserve.
Let me get this straight. She's supposed to be a watchdog, but the people she's supposed to be watching, they get to choose her.
That's right. And that doesn't make a lot of sense, does it?
Grayson says the Federal Reserve needs a new watchdog, and he's co-sponsoring a bill to bring more accountability, transparency, and oversight. The bill would force the notoriously secretive Fed to open its books to an audit, making public who the Fed lends to and on what terms.
Getting both Republicans and Democrats on board on auditing the Federal Reserve System.
The bill was the brainchild of Republican Congressman Ron Paul from Texas, who's been trying to pass it since 1983. Now, everyone from Republican talk show host Glenn Beck on the hard right to Senator Bernie Sanders on the hard left is pushing for it. In the House, every Republican, along with 110 Democrats, led by Grayson, has signed on to Ron Paul's bill.
Ron Paul, in this case, is right. And I'm prepared to work with a Republican who's right for the benefit of the public. So that's what we've done. We've joined with him, taken a bill that hasn't been successful literally for more than 2 decades. And we've reached a point now where almost 2/3 of the members of Congress support it because it's no longer a Republican bill. It's a good government bill.
But do we really want Congress being able to intervene in the independence of the Fed?
Congress certainly is not going to be telling the Fed anytime soon, you should expand the money supply by 6.3%. That's not what we do. But that's not what the Fed's been doing since last September. They've been making deals with their friends on Wall Street and doing that at the taxpayer's expense.
There is clearly a lot of hostility in Congress about the Fed. And the Fed is in the period of greatest vulnerability to loss of its independence.
Larry Meyer was a Federal Reserve governor from 1996 to 2002. To say that he opposes opening the Fed's books is putting it mildly.
If we had a situation where a bill came up and had a serious chance of passing, reducing the Fed independence, markets would be in chaos, the equity market would collapse, inflation expectations would soar, and you hope that chaos would be enough to have Congress reconsider.
People on the other side of the argument basically say the government has undertaken the biggest, most extensive financial endeavor in our lifetime. We're a democracy. It's our money. So what's so dangerous about letting the public know where the money has gone and what the collateral is?
Do we want transparency? There are trade-offs in this world. Certainly we understand there are trade-offs. Transparency is good, but so is the ability of the Fed to lend under unusual and exigent circumstances to banks to be the liquidity provider of the last resort. We would do extraordinary damage to the economy if we interfered with that.
What kind of damage could be done if you put up on the website,
okay,
X, Y, and Z was in here yesterday?
Okay, so let's say Citi is the first bank and says, I'm in trouble. Okay, I need emergency lending. And the Fed says, okay, please go out, have a press conference and announce to everybody you're in trouble. Okay, then come back. Okay? Are they going to do that?
Well, you tell me.
I don't think so.
Do that?
I don't think so. Okay?
Because?
Because that'd be runs on their bank. No, none of the people who are their counterparties would do business with them anymore. Nobody in the private sector will lend them any money.
The Obama administration has not taken an official position, but Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner told the Wall Street Journal an audit is, quote, a line we don't want to cross. That's what Wall Street, big banks, and many economists think. Congress, they say, has no business getting into the details of monetary policy. But Congressman Grayson is all about the details. In this hearing last January, he bore in on Federal Reserve Vice Chairman Donald Cohn for more information about the Fed's loans.
I'd like to know how much was given to Credit Suisse and what you got in return. How much was given to Citibank, what you got in return. If you put out $50 billion to Credit Suisse, the taxpayers need to know that.
I'd be very concerned, Congressman, that if we published the individual names of who was borrowing from us, no one would borrow from us. The purpose of our borrowing is not to support individual institutions, but to support the credit markets.
Has that ever happened? Have people ever said, we will not take your $100 billion because people will find out about it?
We said we will not publish the names of the borrowers, so we'll have no test of that.
This subject is resonating with many Americans. You hear it in town hall meetings and other forums. The basic question is, why does the Federal Reserve have so much power? What's the answer to that?
The answer is because Congress gave it that much power. And it did so intelligently because it knew it couldn't responsibly carry out those tasks itself. Given the political wrangling in Congress, we can see it today in the dysfunctional nature of Congress. Whatever the Democrats say, the Republicans say the opposite. It takes forever to get a bill through. And that's why Congress and parliaments around the world have delegated to their central banks this authority because they knew it was too important to try to do it themselves.
Congress created the Federal Reserve in 1913 in response to a series of banking crises, giving it the power to regulate the money supply, oversee commercial banks, and provide loans to banks in trouble. Nowhere in the law did it say the loans must be confidential. That's just the way it's always been done. After the Great Depression of the 1930s, Congress gave the Fed even more power, allowing it to lend to anyone it chooses if the circumstances are, quote, unusual and exigent.
It's kind of been standing there like a financial militia, waiting for a crisis like this.
David Wessel is economics editor of the Wall Street Journal and author of a new book, In Fed We Trust, about the Fed's unprecedented actions to steer the country out of the financial crisis.
When the crisis came, we discovered they had all sorts of weapons in their cabinets that we didn't know they had. They dusted off things that no one had ever occurred to them they would need since the Great Depression.
The crisis came in September 2008, when Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy.
Literally, the financial system freezes up. If you're thinking of the human body as a metaphor, it's like you have some kind of blockage in your arteries and the blood is no longer circulating.
The Federal Reserve started printing money, lots of it. By December 2008, its balance sheet had more than doubled, from $870 billion before the crisis to $2.2 trillion. And for the first time since the Great Depression, the Fed started lending not just to commercial banks, but also to insurance companies, investment banks, and other big corporations it doesn't regulate.
They're lending to AIG, they lend to industrial companies that can't get money the regular way, they lend money into the mortgage market. They basically do whatever it takes to prevent the implosion of the financial system from causing what Bernanke called in my conversations with him, Depression 2.0.
The Federal Reserve didn't just lend money. Congressman Grayson says it also played favorites by extending Citigroup, a deal that other banks didn't get. The Fed promised to cover $250 billion of Citigroup's so-called toxic assets if they should lose value. Last February, Grayson grilled Citigroup CEO Vikram Pandit about that deal.
You tell me, Mr. Pandit, where I can get a deal like this, where I can get $250 billion in insurance, as you put it, for toxic assets that barely have a bid in the marketplace and only pay $7 billion for that. You tell me where I can get a deal like that.
Congressman, the only thing I would say to you is that these aren't necessarily toxic assets at all. The government has gone through these assets very carefully. They've gone through what the expected losses might be on this. They did their work. And I think that's an important aspect that is not in this document.
Well, if it turns out that they're not truly toxic and there is an upside, who gets the upside?
The losses and the profits are netted on this pool of assets, and if there are profits beyond that, they are city's profits.
Right. So you get 100% of the upside, and the government gets 90% of the downside, correct?
That is what the insurance contract is designed to do.
Have you heard the phrase, Mr. Pennant, heads I win, tails you lose?
I appreciate that, Congressman. I don't think it applies here.
Congressman Grayson says the collateral on many deals is, at best, unclear.
For all we know, the Federal Reserve has taken losses in the billions on these assets, possibly even the tens or hundreds of billions in the name of the taxpayer, and we don't know because the balance sheet is basically a way not to tell what's going on as opposed to the true version of any balance sheet, the true purpose of a balance sheet, which is to tell the truth.
John gets here.
It's not just Congressman Grayson who wants more transparency from the Fed.
Right now we're running the Fed's minutes as #1 story and top.
At Bloomberg News in New York City, reporter Mark Pittman says his efforts to track the Fed's lending have been stymied.
We got answers back, which was kind of like, we have your request, we're thinking about it. And then the next thing would be, we have your request and we found 500 documents that apply to it. And then the next thing that would come is like, but you can't have any of them. Well, okay.
We were not accommodated, to say the least.
Bloomberg editor Matt Winkler finally filed a lawsuit against the Federal Reserve, trying to compel them to turn over the specifics of who got what. Pittman says there's still much we don't know.
In short, we don't really know what our risk is. We have suspicion, but we don't know what it is, and that's the disturbing thing in a democracy.
Last month, a judge agreed and ordered the Fed to disclose the information. The Fed asked for and was granted a stay and is expected to appeal.
Meeting's adjourned.
While the Federal Reserve defends itself in court, on Capitol Hill, it must fight off that audit and a growing concern about the repercussions of printing all that money.
When the Federal Reserve creates $1 trillion out of thin air and hands it out, that cheapens every dollar that's in your pocket. It cheapens the value of your 401k, it cheapens the value of your checking account, it cheapens the value of your pay stub. And that's why we need checks and balances.
What's the worst case scenario?
The worst case scenario is wild inflation. And we could well be heading that way with the kind of irresponsible handouts and bailouts that we've been seeing lately by the Federal Reserve.
Congressman Alan Grayson. Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke has been praised by President Obama for his, quote, bold action and out-of-the-box thinking. And he's likely to be confirmed by the Senate for a second term. Economists say that Bernanke faces a delicate task ahead. He must continue the Fed's lending long enough to get the economy standing on 2 feet, but pull it back before a nasty burst of inflation occurs. Bernanke must also discourage further reckless, extreme risk-taking by Wall Street. And he's pushing for Congress to give the Fed more authority. So he says that it may oversee not just the banks, but the entire financial system. Congressman Grayson, as you might expect, opposes that move. Now, coming up next, we take you to the front lines as U.S. Marines surge south in Afghanistan. So stay here with us. Missed an edition of Dan Rather Reports? Or just want to see one again? We're now available on iTunes, so check us out. The news from Afghanistan is growing increasingly grim. After a summer of major operations and high casualties, the top commander, U.S. Army General Stanley McChrystal, has sent the White House a sobering assessment. The message? He may need tens of thousands more boots on the ground to avoid what he calls failure. As the debate in Washington heats up over how many U.S. troops should be sent into the war in Afghanistan, it's important to remember that the United States is already in the midst of ramping up its forces. The previously approved buildup began just months ago, with Marines pouring into southern Afghanistan. The challenges these young Americans face on the ground, their successes and their struggles, serve as an important case study for the benefits and costs of further escalation. Our reporter-producer Lucian Reed spent several weeks with the Marines as they established and began to carry out their mission. To provide an added perspective, Lucian was joined for some of that time by Seth Moulton, who served 4 active tours as a Marine officer in Iraq. This is what they witnessed and brought back for you to see and think about. These Marines at Camp Leatherneck in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, are part of the first wave of the 22,000 additional troops that President Obama ordered here earlier in the summer.
1, 2, and 3.
They are here to implement a strategy that is modeled after what commanders see as their successes in Iraq. An entire Marine battalion, about 1,500 men in total, has been assigned to a single district, an area with a population of less than 80,000.
81s will be landing here at LZ3, and 3rd Platoon will be moving there.
The Marines' job is to drive out the insurgents, secure the district, and reintroduce government into an area that has been under Taliban control for almost a year. American troops haven't been in this part of Afghanistan in significant numbers since August 2008, but several British units have been operating in the area, manning small outposts and training Afghan soldiers. A few of these British soldiers will be traveling with the Marines.
And then they'll just withdraw and leave it booby-trapped with IEDs, so I'd be very, very cautious.
The British soldiers repeatedly warned the Marines about IEDs, improvised explosive devices, which in the last 6 months have become the biggest single threat to troops here. In the past, coalition forces in Afghanistan worried mostly about small arms attacks, being shot at with machine guns and mortars. Now, more than half of all U.S. casualties here are caused by roadside bombs, a situation that increasingly resembles the dark days of the war in Iraq. As dusk falls on Camp Leatherneck, the Marines of Alpha Company ready themselves for the helicopter assault that will drop them under cover of darkness in the countryside of the district of Nawa. As the sun rises, the Marines begin their trek through the farmland of the Helmand River Valley. The Marines spend most of their day in tedious silence, cautiously traversing miles of countryside that could be booby-trapped with IEDs. These are the images of a war where the threats are ever present, but usually invisible. America has a long and complicated history in Helmand Province. In 1957, the U.S. government launched a multi-million-dollar irrigation project here that, over the next 2 decades, helped transform what used to be a desert valley into highly productive farmland. The impact of the project was so significant that this area became known for a time as Little America. But in 1979, with the Soviet invasion, the project ended, and the U.S. hasn't had much of a presence in Little America since. During the war, U.S. troops have passed through to clear the area of Taliban, but there have never been enough troops to hold the province, and the Taliban have always returned. After the Marines left last summer, Some residents of Helmand faced violent reprisals from the Taliban for their cooperation with U.S. troops. A big challenge for the Marines is convincing the locals that this time they're going to stay.
We're pushing up here to set a permanent security to keep the Taliban out.
Let him know we're not going anywhere. We're gonna stay here.
The Marines are in the countryside for several days. The hours of silent trekking interrupted only by these brief encounters with farmers. These are the mundane first steps in building a relationship with the local community.
John.
What can we do for you?
Well, we're kind of, we've heard some reports the Taliban have been coming around in the area.
At night, the Marines sleep in schools and houses in the communities. The Taliban seem to have fled in advance of the Marines' arrival, so for the most part, the Marines' run-ins with locals are uneventful. But it's impossible to be sure that some of these local farmers aren't moonlighting as insurgents. In one house, a British soldier finds a stockpile of fertilizer that could be used to make explosives.
If he's using the fertilizer on his land, then there's no way he can have a year's supply there. He has the equipment here to make homemade explosives, and he has enough fertilizer for us to arrest him today.
The man claims he is storing the fertilizer on behalf of other landowners for whom he works. In the end, the decision is made by an Afghan officer. Although there are only a handful of Afghan National Army soldiers traveling with the Marines, they are the ones responsible for making arrests.
He's saying, as far as I know, these are ordinary people. He must let the owner know that we are going to mark this property, okay, and that it will be checked again in the future.
Although the Marines face surprisingly little resistance during their push into Helmand, it's not all easy going.
Hey, Staff Sergeant.
Yeah.
Hey,
give me on the small right here. Give me on the small.
Small?
You see him?
Hey, which way are we putting the mortars?
You don't orient it that way in that direction.
We're channel north.
A firefight breaks out between insurgents and another Marine unit a few hundred meters up the road.
Real fucking close.
Yeah. Hey, Roger, that's an impact right by our position.
You got friendlies? 6 o'clock from your position? Where the 240 fire just came from.
But the Taliban seem to know that they're outnumbered, and after 10 minutes, they've disappeared into and beyond the tree line. This brief encounter illustrates one of the biggest conundrums facing military and civilian leaders. With superior numbers and firepower, it's relatively easy for U.S. troops to push the Taliban out of an area, but how do they keep them out? For some insight into that question, we visited the nearby village of Nawa, the district's administrative center. Another Marine company arrived here a few weeks earlier. Commanders say things have already gotten better. Lieutenant Colonel William McCullough.
For 14 months, this district center was essentially under siege. The local police controlled from 500 meters to 1,000 meters outside of this base. And this was an isolated island. Fewer and fewer people coming to the market. Fewer and fewer things happening. Constant fighting just right at the tree line outside of here.
Lieutenant Colonel McCullough is the commander in charge of the entire Marine Battalion in the district of Nawa. He came to Afghanistan after 2 tours in Iraq's violent Afghan Province, where he helped train the Iraqi army and worked as a liaison to tribal leaders. As he takes on the monumental task of securing the district of Nawa and bringing normalcy back to its people, he is working closely with 2 other men. Ian Purvis, a civilian stabilization advisor with the British government, and Captain Gus Biggio, a civil affairs officer attached to the battalion. They have high hopes for what they can accomplish.
People here in Helmand Province, many of them remember when this This area was called Little America, and they were happy, safe, economically viable, and we hope that we can help get them back to that stage.
Captain Biggio left a job as a Wall Street lawyer to join the reconstruction effort in Afghanistan. He told us that the situation in Nawa has changed dramatically since he arrived. The Friday market, almost deserted a few weeks ago, is now thriving.
It was amazing to see. This was something that hadn't occurred for about 8 or 9 months. And 2 weeks ago, 1,000 to 1,500 people came to the district center to buy and sell things, to bring their livestock, bring other goods that they had, because they felt safe. I asked, the first day I saw this happening, I asked 50 people, why did you come back? The answer that I got 50 times was because it's safe. The second week, there was even more people here.
But Captain Biggio was quick to add that the success and visibility of the market also poses a risk.
I think it's a great indication that people are starting to feel comfortable with the security situation. But that also presents a key target for IED emplacement and suicide bombers.
Our cameras captured firsthand the threat posed by IEDs during a convoy into Nawa. This armored Marine vehicle was hit by an IED just in front of the vehicle carrying our reporters. There were only minor injuries, but it's a stark reminder that while the security situation has improved in Helmand Province, the Taliban hasn't yet surrendered this area to coalition forces.
Did your head hit the top or your seatbelt just...
I don't remember.
After the explosion, the Marines immediately set to work interviewing locals who might know something about the bombers and combing the area for other explosives. When they find another IED up the road, an explosive ordnance disposal team detonates it from a safe distance. Later, we are shown the simple homemade device that triggered the IED.
We got several D-cell batteries here taped to the series circuit. Here we got 2 pieces of wood separated with rubber. On the inside, there could be any type of metal contact, such as nails or sheet metal, 10 to 15 pounds. And detonate this device, close the circuit.
These homemade explosives are deadly to Afghan civilians as well. A bomb built to be triggered by a mere 10 or 15 pounds can rip apart an armored vehicle, but could just as easily be set off by a child. According to Marine commanders, during the week we were in Nawa, over 40 residents of Helmand Province were injured or killed by IEDs. Despite the ongoing risks, the security situation has improved enough to arrange a visit from the provincial governor.
You'll see that as you walk around the bazaar later today.
He arrives from the capital city of Lashkar to hold a shura, a meeting of elders that is a crucial step toward re-establishing government in this area. British Stabilization Advisor Ian Purvis.
The government here is very, very weak because the Taliban has essentially held the district of Nawa for the past 12 months. So we are starting from a very, very low level.
At the Shura, the provincial governor tries to persuade the elders to support the Marines' efforts in Helmand.
د شفاخانه او د کلینیکونو د فعالولو د سرکونو د جوړېدلو او د خلکو د عزت او سوکالۍ لپاره کوم پلان او برنامه ورسره وه تاسو ټول به ماته ځواب راکړئ چې نه هېڅکله نه.
An important district administrator also arrives. His name is Haji Mohammed Khan. Although he is from Nawa, for the past year he has been living out of town, out of fear for his safety.
زه دغه ورځ جمعه و چې طالبان دلته راغلل
نو بیا ماته دا ورونه هم وویل هغه دلته راغلي وه زامنو مې هم راته وویلی چې نن شپه طالبان راځي زموږ دا ګرده کوهول چې ته د ولسوالۍ ماوین یې موږ به هم په خطر کې یو مړه به سو در سره ته به مړ شي ته به د دې ځای څخه په هره طریقه چې د دې ځای څخه به وځې لښکرګاه ته به ځې په هغه ورځ د جمعې بیا زه رئیس ولم دغه ته ورته خلاص کړه نو ورته
Now that the district administrator has returned, the Marines ask for his help in convincing other government officials to come back to Nawa.
Does he think they will come back, or does he think that they will be afraid to come back?
بالکل نه خو شرطشناس به مو دیدن ما به دیدن حتما
They will come in.
This may be an opportunity. Your return is a big symbol to a lot of people.
The Marines take a long walk outside Nawa with the district administrator and the governor of Nawa. As they pass canals that the U.S. helped construct over 40 years ago, they discuss a new development project, building a road to connect the district center with these outlying areas.
Is there a road on the other side of this canal that if we made a bridge?
Colonel McCullough believes it's projects like this to improve the security and quality of life of local residents that are the key to winning over the sympathies and cooperation of Afghan citizens.
Taliban supporters are in the minority. The majority of the people don't support the Taliban, nor do they support ISAF. What they support is anybody who brings a sense of normalcy back to their life. If that's us, they support us. If that's the Taliban, they support the Taliban.
At the end of their walk, the Marines and Afghans reach the district administrator's house. The grass has grown tall in his absence. The house has been ransacked, and most of his belongings are gone. But there is hope for rebuilding.
Your home right now is kind of representative of the whole district. Just came through a bad time?
داسې به هم راسي داسې ورځې به راسي چې په ګیسټ روم کې به سره ناستې سره ټي به کوو ډوډۍ به کوو
You will be sitting in that guest room with me, drinking tea, eating food with me.
انشاءالله
I believe it, absolutely.
Thank you.
We have a lot of work in front of us.
My dear Carl Rumush.
But it all can be done.
Why kawala is which kawala na vi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Matara kida.
It's a promising beginning, but Lieutenant Colonel McCullough emphasized that it is just the beginning.
It could be tempting for people to say, it looks good, let's send them somewhere else. But it's not one yet. This is a long-term campaign plan. 1st Battalion, 5th Marines is slated to stay in Nawa through the end of the year, and another Marine battalion is already scheduled to take over for them. For now, everything is in place to continue a strategy that seems to be working, if only in one district. But as the debate over troop levels continues in Washington, no one can say whether civilian leaders will send enough troops to spread this strategy to other parts of Afghanistan. And no one can say exactly how long troops will have to stay here in order to make the current stability permanent. Lieutenant Colonel McCullough couldn't tell us when the Afghan National Army will be ready to take over full responsibility for Helmand Province. It's possible Americans will lose patience long before that happens.
The key factor now is time. At the end of the day, the local population is going to sit on the fence. They have got to be convinced that the government of Afghanistan is here to stay, because they've seen this all before. Over the past 15, 20 years, they have seen regimes come and go, governments come and go, and they know all of these are transient. For them, they still have suspicions that this one is transient, and time will be the critical factor.
U.S. Marines and their experiences in southern Afghanistan. When we return, a discussion with our two reporters on this story. Their thoughts about life on the front lines. Coming up next. You've seen tonight the sights and sounds of the U.S. escalation in southern Afghanistan. But how does that fit into the larger picture of the war? To answer this question, I sat down with the two reporters on tonight's story. Lucian Reed is a renowned photojournalist who has reported extensively for this program from Iraq and Afghanistan. For this report, he spent several weeks with U.S. Marines from the very start of their deployment. He was joined for some of that time by Seth Moulton, now in the Marine Reserves. While on active duty in Iraq, he worked closely with General David Petraeus. Seth is now getting a joint business and public policy degree at Harvard University, and it was there that we sat down for a recent conversation. Well, let's talk. Seth, tell me about the mission to Helmand. What did you see? What's the most important thing you saw, heard, and learned?
Well, we put a lot of Marines into Helmand, and it's making a difference, at least in the short term. I mean, towns that hadn't seen any reprieve from the Taliban for several years are really coming back to life, and people are going to the markets, kids are going to school, and there's a real palpable change on the ground that the Marines have brought security. But at the same time, I think it's hard to see a real long-term plan. You know, when you went to Iraq in 2007 under the surge, a company commander at a small outpost in Ramadi, he understood that he had to focus on his neighborhood and maybe just fix this small portion of the city. But he could also articulate how doing that contributed to the security of Ramadi. And Ramadi is important because it's the capital of Anbar Province. And Anbar Province is important because it's the seat of the Sunnis, and the Sunnis are an important constituent in parliament. And so all the way on up, you could see, or he could see, how his peace fit into the larger strategy for Afghanistan.
That was in Iraq.
But that was in Iraq. I didn't see that as much in Afghanistan. It was harder for the on-the-ground leaders to really articulate where this was going. I mean, you'd secured this town of Nawa where Lucian and I were. But what was the long-term plan? What fundamental changes were you going to make in the local government to ensure that when the Marines leave in a few years, the Taliban doesn't come back? Or what do you do about the areas in Afghanistan, or even the areas right in Helmand Province where there aren't a lot of Marines, where we don't have the troops to just blanket the area and provide security for the population? There just doesn't seem to be a very clear overarching strategy to answer these questions.
I want to come back to that in a moment. Lucian, let's bring you into this. What did you see, hear, feel, and learned that you thought was the most important on this trip?
Sort of a couple of things. The Marines went into this part of the country. There hadn't been a sustained presence there in a long time. They were able to go in such numbers that they could sort of drive the Taliban out for the time being and then begin to interact with the people. And what I was, like I said, sort of pleasantly surprised by was that it seemed like the people there really, really welcomed them. You know, it could be that, you know, when a man shows up to your front door with a gun and asks you a question, you know, you're going to try to be pleasant with him. But every single person that I saw them talk to essentially expressed some sort of relief that they were there, expressed some sort of hopefulness for their presence there, but also conversely expressed doubt about the long-term commitment. You know, you guys have been here before and you left, the Brits have been here before and you left, and you always leave us to the Taliban.
I'll give you an example of this and some of the concerns that I saw. We were with 1-5 Marines. It was a reinforced battalion with about 1,400 troops. Now, in the same area that those 1,400 Marines controlled, there were 138 Afghan National Police and 88 Afghan National Army soldiers. Now, of course, there are plans to increase that number, but I mean, even if you doubled it, I mean, it's very hard to imagine that number of Afghan troops taking over for 1,400 Marines.
Well, that's not going to happen, we know. I mean, down the road, the hope is to build up the Afghan police and the Afghan army to the point where they can take over. Well, question, Lucian, I'll start with you and we'll go to you, Seth. Who is the enemy? Increasingly, people in this country are saying, well, I'm a little confused. Is the enemy the Taliban? Is it Al-Qaeda? Are they one and the same? Whom does the Marine see as the enemy?
There, it's pretty much what people back in the States think of as the Taliban. Most of those guys are probably local. You know, when the Marines came in, you know, they came in and they were expecting a big fight, and then they didn't have much of a fight, and they're sort of, well, where did everybody go? And you know, most of the people they were going to be dealing with just sort of faded back into the background, back into the countryside, and sort of fell back on laying IEDs, which is sort of the new old weapon. You know, everybody's used to it from Iraq, but it really hasn't been a huge part of the war in Afghanistan. up until the last 6 to 8 months, maybe a year, where it's really just, they're widespread. I mean, they're everywhere. The guys I was with 1-5, in the 3 or 4 weeks they were there, they lost 4 MRAPs in a Humvee, and that's probably what, $1 million worth of armed vehicles gone with not much effort really on the part of the Taliban.
There was a lot of criticism leading up to the Marines push into Helmand Province that if you put that many troops in there, you'll just see a lot more incidents. The enemy will have targets. And so if your aim is to protect the population, you're not going to accomplish that by just putting an awful lot of Marines down there and having a lot more violence. And that it did not come true. In fact, in many ways, it was sort of a vindication of the Powell Doctrine, that if you put in overwhelming force, that it will carry the day.
Not long after the Marines got there, one began hearing that while they certainly had firefights, they certainly had real combat, some of it intense, that by and large the Taliban had slipped away, which is in the nature of guerrilla armies, and they'd showed up in a section of Afghanistan where the Germans were or some other nationality was. That presents the perhaps overworked analogy of the whack-a-mole. Okay, in Helmand you whack them, but they pop up over here where the Brits are or where the Germans are. Did that happen, Lucian?
Yeah, I mean, quick. And Kunduz, which has been in the news a fair bit these last days because of a civilian casualty incident, is one of those places. And it was, I was there in April, and it was a little dodgy, but you can sort of go around, and I was out on the streets and investigating things and talking to people, and now, no, you wouldn't want to do it.
There's a certain sense in which that strategy can be okay if Helmand is just of such strategic importance that curtailing the Taliban's source of funding by controlling Helmand Province really cripples them throughout Afghanistan, then it's okay if you push a few more Taliban into different areas that are less important, and so violence picks up a little bit in the mountains, for example.
And if some of what was there goes elsewhere, it's still worth the mission.
Right, but we don't know if that's true yet. We haven't seen the results. We don't know if the Taliban will really be crippled by securing Helmand and reducing their flow of drugs and narcotics money to other parts of the country.
Did we send enough troops to Helmand? Do we have enough troops there now?
In my opinion, in the parts of Helmand where Lucian and I were embedded, we did have enough troops. In the town of Nawa, the Marines controlled the town, and it was working. People were happy the Marines were there because they were able to go back to their normal lives. But in the province as a whole, I'm not quite sure.
I guess to me this is sort of the most important point, and the thing that is sort of is a lesson for going forward. The first experiment really was sending a large number of reinforcements. Where we sent them, they did what we wanted them to do. I think it's successful. There's fighting there, there's casualties, but I think, by and large, the goal was accomplished. But the result from that experiment, besides an accomplishment of the goal, is that now you can see that, yes, we want to do what we want to do. This is the number of troops it takes in a very small area. 4,000 Marines on the ground, 10,000 in the wider AO to hold down, a place that was 100 miles long and 5 miles wide or something. And so it's an object lesson that if you want to do this, this is how many you're going to need. In my opinion, I don't think we're yet prepared to sort of shoulder that kind of burden.
About the elections, at least one of the purposes of bringing the Marines in was to provide stability for the elections. Did it work?
I was in Afghanistan during the election, and there was a curious sort of thing where the first reporting out of Nawa, where we were, was 0 votes. And then a week later, they magically found several thousand votes. So I wasn't there, I didn't see it, but even if they did provide enough stability to have an election, did anybody really show up, and who voted or who didn't vote?
You think those are open questions?
Yeah.
We've said the Marines provided the stability, but whether people actually went to the polls or not.
We heard a story from a gentleman who was talking to a member of the Afghan intelligence services, and they asked the gentleman, they said, who do you think is going to win the election? And he said, well, Mr. Karzai is going to win the election. And the gentleman said, well, everybody's been predicting Karzai would win for a while, but just in the past week or so, Abdullah's really been rising in the polls, so he might just take it. And the intelligence officer looked back and said, no, you don't understand. Karzai is going to win.
There's an epilogue to that story, and that's that this gentleman that we're talking about was assassinated. This official, they got to him, which I think is pretty stunning.
What should be the takeaway for our audience, given your experience in time there?
The troops on the ground are doing a great job. They're accomplishing the mission they've been given. But they need to know how this mission in a place like Helmand Province fits into a reasonable, larger strategic plan for Afghanistan, a plan that can see us winning the war in a reasonable time frame. That's still unclear. We need a strategic plan for Afghanistan, and we need an explanation, I think, from the administration as to why we're there. There may be no better option. You know, I mean, look, I mean, Afghanistan is a place that has strategic importance to the United States. I'm not denying that for 1 minute. It was people in Afghanistan that attacked us on September 11th, and we should never forget that. But we need to be continually re-asking the question if what we're doing there today is the best way, the most efficient way, the least costly way to achieve security here at home.
Lucian, what do you think our audience's main takeaway should be?
I'm sort of an optimist on the thing, mostly because I still believe that most of the people there want us to be there, and that there are, in addition to the strategic reasons for being there, I think we've made a commitment there. I think that there are things about our national identity, our national character that should bring us there. I know you're very interested in women's issues. Every time I drive by a girls' high school in Kabul, I think, you know, we got to keep at this thing, because if we don't, all of those women are going back into a metaphorical cave. So I think, you know, that's something that people should not lose sight of, or at least that, in my opinion, that I try not to lose sight of. You know, one of the things I feel like sometimes is that oftentimes with all of the bad news coming out of there, that every time one of our leaders or, you know, politicians or the president or anybody sort of comes out and says, you know, we're losing this thing, I think we're losing it just a little bit more, because the Taliban sees that. And one of the reasons I think the war has changed and has gotten so hot lately is that they have the momentum, they have confidence, they have, you know, sort of history on their side. And every time they see sort of weakness from us, it just gives them that much more impetus to hold on and keep fighting. And the only way that we're going to make a success of it is if we match that. That's my feeling.
I think that's true. And let me just say one more thing. One of the things I noticed before I went over there is I was fairly skeptical of Afghanistan for a lot of strategic reasons, skeptical of our commitment there and whether it's really the right strategic decision for the United States at this time in 2009. But I noticed that people who had been there, who'd spent time there, diplomats, troops, really came back more optimistic and more committed, it seemed, than I was as an outside observer. And I think I understand a little bit better, having spent just a little bit of time there, because like Lucian said, when you're on the ground, you can see that a lot of Afghans really do believe in us. They believe that we provide a better future for them, at least a hope of a better future. And you can also see that some of the things we're doing are working. And you can see how really, truly evil the Taliban is. At the same time, there's a great argument that we can't just be spending so many young American lives and treasure on these issues of women's rights in a country that's so different from us, from ours, and so far away, a place that it's going to be very hard to change their values. But you also have to think that, you know what, if we don't start changing some of these things, if we don't start changing the lives of these Afghan children, then they'll just give rise to another generation of religious conservatives bent on attacking the United States and the Western values for which we stand.
A unique perspective and some context from the front lines of a difficult and increasingly controversial war. And that's our program for tonight. From New York, for HDNet, Dan Rather reporting. Good night. If you would like to add your name to an email list for information on upcoming programs, or if you would just like to send a question or comment, please email us at viewer@hd.net.